Something is seriously wrong inside Joe's operation, and the more we learn about what happened to her, the harder it becomes to believe that her kidnapping was simply an enemy attack. The biggest clue may actually be the way the kidnappers found her in the first place. They knew where Joe was. They knew how to reach her home. They understood her tracking system well enough to remove the device from her body. And that raises a terrifying possibility. Somebody on the inside may have given them everything they needed. Because if an enemy organization had simply discovered Joe through surveillance, that would be one thing. But knowing her movements, her location, her family situation, and the technical details of her tracking system suggests something much more deliberate. Someone didn't just find Joe. Someone may have helped the enemy find her. And that's where episodes 3 and 4 become extremely important. Episode 3 appears to take this mystery from suspicion to investigation. Joe can no longer assume that everyone around her is loyal. The people sitting in the command room with her aren't automatically allies anymore. Every person who has access to classified information suddenly becomes a potential suspect. That changes the entire dynamic. Imagine being Joe and realizing that the information you receive every day could be compromised. You can't simply ask the team to investigate the leak because the person you're asking could potentially be the person responsible for creating it. The normal chain of command becomes a weakness. So I think Joe is going to stop playing by the usual rules. Instead of immediately revealing everything she knows, she may start conducting her own test. Different people could receive different pieces of information, and Joe could then watch which piece eventually reaches the enemy. If one specific detail suddenly appears in enemy hands, Joe would know exactly where it came from. And that would create one of the most dangerous situations we've seen in this story because Joe wouldn't just be hunting a criminal anymore. She would be hunting someone she personally knows. Now let's talk about the obvious suspects. Cruz is probably one of the easiest characters to point toward because we've already seen her question the morality of the program. She isn't blindly loyal to every mission, and she has previously challenged whether certain operations were actually justified. But that's also why I don't think she's necessarily the traitor. There is an important difference between questioning an organization and secretly betraying it. Cruz's doubts seem connected to her conscience. She doesn't appear to want innocent people hurt. That could actually make her one of the least likely people to deliberately hand Joe over to an enemy. However, the show could use that exact assumption against us. If everyone thinks Cruz is too obvious, perhaps that's precisely why she becomes the perfect person to hide a larger secret behind. Then there's Bobby. Bobby hasn't received nearly as much attention, and that's exactly what makes the character interesting. When a thriller keeps a character close to the action but gives the audience very little access to their thoughts, there's always a possibility that something important is being hidden. We don't necessarily need Bobby to be an evil mastermind. The betrayal could be much more complicated. Maybe Bobby passed along information without understanding who would eventually receive it. Maybe someone manipulated her. Maybe she believed she was protecting the operation while unknowingly exposing it. And that possibility fits the larger theme of this storyline. The danger may not come from one obvious villain. It could be a chain of compromises. Byron is another person who deserves serious attention. He's close enough to command to potentially know sensitive information, including details about Joe's movements and the operation itself. And there's something suspicious about characters who suddenly become extremely determined to find the person responsible. Sometimes the person searching for the traitor is the person trying hardest to make sure nobody looks in their direction. I'm not saying Byron is definitely guilty. In fact, his concern for Joe could be completely genuine. But in a mystery like this, genuine emotions don't necessarily clear someone of suspicion. Then we have Kaitlyn. And honestly, Kaitlyn might be the most complicated possibility of all. Kaitlyn has always shown that she is willing to make extremely difficult decisions if she believes they protect the larger mission. That's different from being a traitor, but it creates an interesting possibility. What if Kaitlyn didn't personally arrange Joe's kidnapping? What if she knew there was a threat and decided not to tell Joe because she believed the mission was more important? That would be a completely different kind of betrayal. Joe could eventually discover that the person she trusted to protect the operation actually knew more than she admitted. And if that happens, the conflict between Joe and Kaitlyn could become much bigger than the original kidnapping. But episode 4 appears to take this mystery even further. The title Murder Hornets suggests that the story is moving from investigation into complete chaos. The team isn't simply looking for one person anymore. They may discover that the breach is connected to a much larger network involving multiple handlers and multiple levels of information. And that changes everything. Because if there is an organized network operating through different handlers, then Joe's kidnapping may have been only one part of a much bigger operation. Someone could have provided Joe's location. Someone else could have provided information about her security. Another person could have helped the kidnappers understand her tracking system. And suddenly, what looked like one betrayal becomes an entire system. That's why I think the Georgetown storyline could become extremely important. The earlier connection involving a Ukrainian-Russian double agent and the search for Alexei Yermov may not have been included simply to introduce another mystery. It could eventually connect directly to the internal breach. What if the person who appears to be helping the team is actually connected to the network they're trying to uncover? Or even more interestingly, what if the information leak started much earlier than Joe realizes? That would mean the enemy has potentially been collecting information for weeks or even longer. And suddenly, every previous scene takes on a different meaning. A conversation that seemed completely harmless could have been information gathering. A suspicious meeting could have been a handoff. A character who seemed nervous could have been afraid of being exposed. And a decision that looked like a mistake might actually have been deliberate. Meanwhile, Neal is facing a completely different kind of battle. While Joe is trying to identify an invisible enemy, Neal is watching his family become increasingly vulnerable because of the life Joe has chosen. That's what makes his storyline so important. Neal doesn't need to understand intelligence operations to understand that his children are in danger. Joe's enemies have already demonstrated that they can reach her home. They have already shown that the people closest to her can become targets. So Neal's frustration isn't simply about Joe's career anymore. It's about whether their family can survive this lifestyle. And I think episode 4 could push that conflict to a breaking point. Neal may finally tell Joe that something has to change. But Joe has a problem. Walking away might not actually make her family safer. If the threat is already inside the operation, leaving could simply mean giving the enemy exactly what they want. And that's what makes the situation so dangerous. Joe can't trust the people around her. She can't completely trust the information she's receiving. She can't simply walk away. And she can't ignore the fact that her family has already been targeted. So what does she do? She investigates. Quietly. Methodically. And possibly without telling anyone what she's really planning. I think this could lead to one of the strongest scenes in the upcoming episodes. Joe deliberately creating false information and watching where it goes. Imagine Joe telling Cruz one version of a plan, Bobby another, Byron something completely different, and Kaitlyn receiving a fourth version. Then the enemy suddenly reacts to one of those pieces. At that moment, Joe doesn't need a confession. She already knows. And whoever the traitor is would immediately realize that Joe has figured it out. That's when the real danger begins. Because a compromised operative who believes they're about to be exposed has only a few options. Run. Disappear. Or eliminate the evidence. And Joe could become the evidence. That's why I don't think episodes 3 and 4 are simply building toward the reveal of a traitor. They're building toward a confrontation between Joe and someone she trusted. The biggest twist could even be that the person responsible isn't completely evil. Maybe they were manipulated. Maybe they were threatened. Maybe they believed they were protecting someone. Or maybe they genuinely believe Joe's operation has become too dangerous and that destroying it is the only way to stop something worse from happening. That would make the eventual reveal much more powerful than simply saying, this character was secretly bad. Because the best betrayals aren't always about good versus evil. Sometimes they're about two people believing they're doing the right thing for completely different reasons. And that's exactly why I think the real mystery isn't simply, who kidnapped Joe? The better question is, who made Joe vulnerable enough to be kidnapped in the first place? Because somebody opened that door. Somebody knew where she was. Somebody understood the system protecting her. And somebody may still be sitting inside the operation, waiting for everyone else to blame the wrong person. If episode 3 confirms that Joe's team has been compromised, episode 4 could expose just how deep that compromise goes. And by the time Joe finally identifies the person responsible, she may discover that the betrayal began much earlier than she ever imagined. So now I want to know what you think. Who is the real traitor? Cruz? Bobby? Byron? Kaitlyn? Or is the show setting up a completely different character that none of us are watching closely enough? Because if this theory is right, the person Joe needs to fear may not be hiding somewhere outside the operation. They may already be standing right beside her. And they may know exactly what Joe is going to do next.